Dowser, friend or fraud? It had been my intention to have a title for this talk that would herald a user-friendly philosophy with an element of sophistication in it, and so I chose the Dowser, friend or Freud. It wasn't until the notices had gone out that I realized that my word processor had translated this into Dowser, friend or fraud, which I fear that some of my frank friends will interpret as a Freudian slip. However, I am glad to see from the papers that I am not the only one to be wrong-footed by a typist's error. There was rather a nice one in one of the Bradford papers a few weeks back, reporting an unsuccessful daylight armed robbery on a sub-post office. Finding himself confronted by a balaclava youth pointing a pistol at him and demanding the contents of the till, Mr. Patel, in faultless English, said, "You are silly man, not knowing that daily I am taking money to bank at 4 o'clock and it is now 4.45 and till is empty. You are also stupid man to think that I would not recognize that look-alike water pistol that I sold to you last week." With a cry of frustration, the youth dashed out of the shop straight into the path of a very surprised local copper who arrested him. The paper reported that when asked what had aroused his suspicions, the policeman said it was the fact that the youth was running, was wearing a balaclava helmet and had a GNU sticking out of his pocket. I can think of no better way of introducing the fraud aspect of my talk than coming clean about my original involvement with the Hampshire Dowsers. Just over 2 years ago I was asked to give the inaugural talk to this group, and then, at the end of it, our founder, Mary Cannon, invited me, in front of the assembled audience, with no avenue of escape, to become your chairman. There was no logic in this because I live in West Sussex, have a Surrey postal address, it takes me 3/4 of an hour to get to my adopted parish, and I am not a member of the Alton Mafia. So on all counts, I am bogus. However, having listened, as many of you have, to 2 years of assorted speakers, I am comforted by the fact that if I am a fraud, then I am not alone. What a wide spectrum of experiences we have had. 1. We have been exposed to hallucination by multicolored bottles of oil and water to the extent that many of our members queued up to buy them from the speaker, at Yves Saint Laurent prices. 2. We have dowsed for switched-off torch beams. 3. We have had our auras measured, both before and after. 4. We have been taught to make loops of thick copper wire so that they will merge into the long grass around our shrubs in the spring and bring our lawn mowers to a grinding halt. 5. We have been asked to test whether we have got clockwise or anti-negation clockwise pendulums by swinging them over an electric cable which might or might not be turned on, or off. 6. We even had a very colorful slideshow entitled Dowsing and Early Mayan Burial Sites, in which the speaker cleverly managed to avoid mentioning dowsing throughout the session. 7. And then of course we were let into the secrets of crop circles, or were we? And on another occasion had a 5-minute preview of a future talk on UFOs and aliens by an ex-chief medical officer of Lapland who is also chief consultant on UFOs to the Boutros Gully Man and the rest of the crazy gang in New York. 8. I have never really understood what chakras did except that we have about half a dozen of them stacked vertically in our bodies, and unless each one rotates in the opposite direction to its neighbors, we feel pretty poorly. I am also a bit puzzled to know why speakers on the subject always, at some stage, have to rub their tummies with a wide circular movement of the hand. 9. And as for healing, well, I hasten to add that the 2 eminent senior members of the British Society of Dowsers, whom I took my aches and pains to, did a wonderful job for virtually peanuts. But the Times magazine of the 15th of October in its diary section carried a story which I cannot resist retelling verbatim. A friend of mine who is very clever, very successful, very astute etc., has been having trouble with his neck. It causes him sleepless nights and he is at the end of his tether. A woman trainer who works out at the gym he uses recommended he went to see a dowser. Indeed, she suggested that he took the following day off work, put himself, his wellies and his raincoat in the car and drove with her to Surrey. So anxious was he for relief from his misery that he agreed. He found himself in a modest house, waiting in a room with 4 nuns from Zaire. When his turn came, the dowser did some spinning with a silver chain, taped pills to his neck and asked him to sit in a chair marked number 1 in a field wearing his raincoat and wellies for the best part of an hour. There was also some jiggery-pokery with a rock and fortified water. On the way home, the woman advised him to stop off at a health food store where, with her guidance, he bought £180 worth of pills and potions. The bill for the day was £300 for the dowser, £300 for the woman who took him to the dowser, plus the vitamins, total £780. But my friend's neck was no better, so he declined to pay the bill. Instead he sent the woman a modest check. He also rang her the next day to explain why. Her mother said that she was at Blackpool at the Labour Party conference, subsequently denied by the Labour Party. There is a thread and pattern that runs, or should run, through all these dowsing sub-disciplines that I have just mentioned. I have purposely adopted a slightly cynical approach to emphasize the fact that, however dedicated, honest and sincere we might be about our dowsing beliefs, the majority of the world think that we are at best a bunch of nutcases and more than likely skilled confidence tricksters as well. They are of course entitled to express their ignorant and bigoted views, and in the face of such opposition it is terribly important that we don't get carried away by our individual enthusiasm, especially in the sub-disciplines for which there is no visible or scientific proof of success. I personally have taken the easy way out by limiting my dowsing scope to water finding, archaeology and the finding of lost secateurs and trowels buried under compost. But I keep a totally open mind about all the other uses of dowsing, and in the hands of a good instructor, I too think I can see fairies at the bottom of the garden. I referred a few moments ago to the essential thread that should be the basis of all forms of dowsing. Those of you who are members of the BSD will be well aware of this because it is the code of ethics which we invite all our members to follow and is printed in full at the back of our journal. It is really just plain common sense, but I think it would be worth quoting the first 2 paragraphs today. 1. In relations with clients, patients and others they shall act in good faith, in accordance with the highest standards of personal integrity and uphold the good name of the society. 2. Being mindful of their responsibilities to others, they should avoid and discourage sensationalism, exaggeration and misleading statements. I heartily endorse the bit about sensationalism. Experienced dowsers know what a killer this can be, but it is very easy for beginners in the art to fall into the trap of using their newfound skills to perform party tricks for the benefit of an audience and to boost their own ego. It invariably diminishes the response that one gets from the quest for knowledge. A good analogy is to imagine that that part of one's subconscious which is your dowsing ability is like a trained spaniel or retriever who delights in performing its primary task at your direction. Should you choose to make it balance a piece of sugar on its nose whilst in the begging position just to demonstrate your command over it, the dog will rapidly get bored and start to do everything in a half-hearted way. Likewise, even in the simple act of walking across a field looking for water with twigs, rods or pendulums, it is always the first twitch or swing which is the strongest and most reliable. Any further passes over the vital spot either to show an onlooker or to give yourself added confidence that you were right the first time will, for me anyway, produce increasingly half-negation-hearted, i.e. bored, responses. And to conclude the subject of showing off or party tricking, be very careful about accepting invitations to go on the stage or the box to prove your skills. The dowsing subconscious loathes doubt and criticism and will wilt and wither under adverse interrogation. Nearly every able dowser I have watched on the box underperformed so badly as to produce results that were virtually no better than coincidence and chance. There are happily exceptions to this rule, and the 2 documentary performances on TV by Donovan Wilkins and the late Roy Talbot were first class by any standards, helped I'm sure by having supportive and believing TV crews recording their activities. There may still be a lingering thought in this audience that, judging by the first part of my talk, I was at heart a semi-believer in everything apart from my own subject. If I did leave that impression, please put it down to sour grapes on my part, as I can assure you that I would love to levitate, to heal and to have little alien friends and even to be able, as the Wilkins can, to look across a field and, from a mirage visible only to them, know that there is probably water 200 feet down. I can't, but I don't doubt that they can. In the presence of a real expert, it is extremely difficult not to think that one is automatically inheriting his skills or his mantle. There is an apocryphal story that many years ago when the film Harvey the Rabbit was showing at the Odeon, Marble Arch, at the end of the second week some of the usherettes who were standing on lonely duty at the top of their respective aisles could be seen to break suddenly into cheery and animated whispered conversation with the thin air beside them. When asked by the manager to explain their bizarre behavior, it became quite clear that their subconscious, to counter their loneliness, had materialized personalized Harveys to keep them company. Good dowsing gurus can have this effect on you too, so if convinced and persuaded that you can walk on water, I suggest that you start at the shore end and not at the boat anchored a mile offshore, particularly if you cannot swim. As that has got us to sea, one way or another. Just a word about submarines and dowsing. In World War I, after much doubt, our Admiralty was persuaded on occasions to use the dowsing services of a middle-aged couple to locate, from the charts, friendly submarines which had failed to communicate to base beyond the allotted time. It is recorded that their success rate was significantly higher than pure chance. The Russians have, I am told, developed this theme. And before their nuclear submarines leave for a long-distance patrol, all the crew have their hair cut ashore. Crew cuts? The clippings are stuffed into a bag and stored safely in the base HQ and used as required as a sample for the dowsers to locate the submerged submarine when it is on radio silence. Of course, the Russians and the Germans now take dowsing much more seriously than we do, and each country has an adequately staffed and financed ministry to control, support and encourage their country's commercial, and I imagine defense, dowsing activities. My last submarine story, vaguely, sort of, related to dowsing, I'm sure must be true because it was written up some years ago in the now defunct Blackwoods magazine. Apparently submarines between the wars, and particularly those in the Mediterranean fleet, were prone to infestation by rats. Because submarines are a labyrinth of holes, pipes, nooks and crannies, these rats were virtually impossible to dislodge permanently, until a rather shady Maltese gentleman offered his services to a submarine berthed in Valletta Harbor. He categorically denied that he would use any traps or poison, but needed 15 minutes alone in the submarine after dark with all the lights out. He was of course searched before going aboard, and with the majority of the crew on shore leave and the anchor watch sitting on the quayside, he disappeared down the hatch. Shortly afterwards, the melodious sound of a flute was heard coursing up and down the bowels of the boat, and at the end of his quarter of an hour the flautist appeared and, still playing, led the boat's complement of rats up the gangplank, across the quay and into the depths of the town. I was stationed in Hameln in Germany, of Pied Piper fame, after the war, and never saw anything like that. You may be wondering by now what the aim of my talk is, and I do realize that I have meandered so widely from subject to subject that I have probably muddied all the waters by now. As you know, there are 3 parts to all our gatherings: the talk, the questions and the tea break, all of equal importance. So I will come clean and say that my real aim has been to prime the pump for question time rather than to bore you with dogma. To this end I will finish with a few dowsing anecdotes to broaden the field a bit. I met the late Bruce McMahon a few years ago for the first time at a BSD Council meeting during one of our annual congresses at Harrogate. We had no opportunity to talk to each other during the meeting, although we were seated side by side, but at the coffee break he came up to me and apologetically explained that during the meeting he had taken the liberty to douse my back with his pendulum, and did I know that I had quite a significant lesion 3/4 of the way down it. I had in fact had it x-rayed the week before because it had been troubling me, but I was staggered that Bruce, a perfect stranger, had been able to locate the spot so accurately. There was no way he could otherwise have known about it, as he lived in Scotland and I lived in Hazelmere. I subsequently became one of his hundreds of satisfied patients, and I thoroughly recommend his wonderful book which the BSD library sells. See note at end of article. Ed. I had a curious request last year from a friend who had a flat in Brighton and had mislaid her jewellery roll. She had previously been burgled and had the original roll stolen from one of her foolproof hiding places in the flat. She subsequently hid the replacement jewellery in a hidey hole where nobody would ever find it, and being my age then couldn't remember where she had put it. She sent me a plan of the flat which I dowsed in the usual way, and found about 3 weak indications which I duly marked on the sketch. I then sent another blank sketch to Clive Beeden, who is expert at these things, and he got another couple of weak signals. We sent the consolidated sketch to the owner, who recognized all our findings as reminiscences of previous hiding places, but sadly no jewellery roll, which she eventually reckoned she might have hidden in her pied-à-terre in London. But Clive doesn't give up easily, and he continued to douse the sketch at periodic intervals, and one day got a strong gold signal which he duly marked on the sketch. The next day he did one more douse before contacting the owner, only to find that the gold had apparently moved and during the course of the day continued to move about the flat. He nevertheless rang up the owner and told his story, but the anticlimax was that he had apparently homed in on a very large and ostentatious gold ring worn by the man in the flat below. As we were never invited to do an on-site douse, we never did find that jewellery roll. My final story possibly has a moral in it. One of the hazards of discovering your newfound talents and knowing that you are right, is that your best friends will in all apparent innocence ask you to douse their house, dacha, Zormagarten or mistress's hideaway to prove you wrong. I was asked to do just that, at their house, I hasten to add, in a little rural community called South Hamilton near Boston, Massachusetts. My American friend said, I've always wondered about this water divining business, would you like to show me how it works by just going round the house and finding the mains water pipe, the sewage outlet and any other water that might be there? I had no trouble in finding the pipes, which he explained afterwards he knew were there because he had helped build the house, but on the opposite side of the house I got a very strong indication of water. Sadly, my host cut me down to size by saying that if I followed him into the house, he would show me why there couldn't possibly be water where I thought I had found it. We went down in the basement, which had been built as a system of utility room, workshops, rumpus room and his teenage son's bedroom cum study. This was the room nearest to where my rods had twitched, and the outside wall had been left undecorated as it had been carved straight from the natural rock, and very effective the raw granite looked too. I had to admit that I could after all be wrong, and obviously was in this case, you win some and you lose some. The following Christmas their card contained a postscript which said, I thought a bit grudgingly, you must have been right after all, our son's wall has just split and the water is pouring in. That is the end of the talk.